Hi, my name is Shane Hatch, and this is my language paper speech specifically on the documentary This is the Zodiac Speaking. This documentary focuses on the Zodiac Killer and his crimes, and it goes into depth on some of the victims who had survived his attacks, as well as the investigators and the police officers and all of the detectives involved, or at least some of the surviving detectives involved in the case of the Zodiac Killer. There were 5 deaths that were caused by the Zodiac Killer, one being two of them being December 20th, 1968, including David Faraday and Betty Lou. David was 17 years old and his girlfriend Betty Lou was 16 years old at Lake Herman in Vallejo, California. There was Darlene Ferner, which occurred on July 5th, 1969, in a park in Vallejo, California. There was in September 27th, 1969, there was Cecilia Shepard at a lake, and in October 11th, 1969, 29-year-old Paul Stein was killed in San Francisco in the Presidio Heights. There were 2 victims that survived, which were a victim from the July 5th, 1969 attack named Mike McGow, and a victim from the September 27th, 1969 attack named Brian Harthel. I also used the bibliography.com for some of the information that I have also spoken about. There were 5 potential other killings that could have been done by the Zodiac Killer, but none of them were confirmed. In this documentary, it talks with some of the officers who were on the scene of the crimes and who investigated what had happened to their victims. It also talks with 2 of the victims, specifically being Mike McGow and Brian Harthel. Starting with our victims, the very first that I'm going to cover today is Mike McGow. He was shot a couple times, one specifically in the face, and a couple to his body. He was in a coma for a short period of time, and it seems as though he has had some altered brain-based issues that make it a little bit difficult for him to be able to give definitive things that had happened to him at the scene of the crime, as well as it being such a traumatic situation. There are certain circumstances where certain information just gets forgotten because of our brains. But he has a little bit of a harder time being able to communicate what was going on. And he showed some very interesting signs of not necessarily excitement, but he was very enthusiastic to talk about what had happened to him. And he was able to explain on some level some of the things that happened, but some of his statements contradicted some other statements that he continued to say further on in the documentary. And it was a little hard to understand what exactly happened, and all the fine-tuned facts of what had happened to him. Although it was very helpful to see some of the investigators be able to talk about what they were told at the scene of the crime, as well as seeing what had happened. But for Mike, his presentation was very, it felt like it was important for him to be talking about it, and it was very obvious by his body language that it was something that not only was he kind of passionate about, but it was something that was heartfelt and meant a lot to him and what happened to him, and it was important for him to tell his story. Moving on to some of the investigators, some of their conversations that they were having in this documentary were a little interesting. They talked about the fact that there were certain things that they talked about in certain statements that they reported at the scene of the crime, and some things that they reported later, as well as their tones were pretty calm, pretty mellow, a little somber, but they were able to accurately describe what they saw at the scene of the crime and be able to explain in a calm, cool, and collected mannerism that was easy for the audience to understand and to be able to transfer and to explain some of the information that they personally experienced, reported, and saw. Moving on to our second victim that survived was from the attack on September 27th, 1969, named Brian Harthel. Brian Harthel was more aware of what happened to him and was able to accurately describe some of the fine details of what occurred at the scene of the crime. In the documentary, he actually goes back to the scene of the crime and was able to describe what occurred to him and the things that he saw. He was able to tell his story in a clear, collected fashion that was not as enthusiastic as Mike's, but was very calm and was able to talk about what happened to him without it being panicky or fast, or anything to the point where it was confusing to understand. It was very clear and organized. For his body language throughout, it seemed really calm, nothing super distracting that took away from what he was trying to explain in the documentary, and he was able to show his experience in a very unique way by taking the documentary back to the scene of the crime and showing what it looked like for him and what his experience of his survival story looked like. Brian was stabbed multiple times in the back. He survived his attack because of his own instinct to not move and to pretend as if he had died. And the Zodiac killer proceeded to attack Cecilia after he had attacked Brian. And Cecilia was struggling and was stabbed in multiple other places and ended up succumbing to her attack. Although she did not die on the spot like some of the other victims, she ended up dying a couple days later in a hospital. Brian explained how he had been tied up and how he was able to free Cecilia, and then Cecilia ended up loosening some of his restraints after a period of time, and he was able to escape and make his way to get help, although they were able to, prior to this, yell out to a boat, and the boat then turned off its motor, went away, and just left them. And what had occurred is that the fisherman had gone to the ranger station, and on the way for Brian, while he was going to get help, the rangers met him part of the way. It's very easy for the audience to be able to understand exactly what Brian went through His story was very clear, it was very organized, and it was spoken with words that were easy and not overwhelming or difficult to understand. He used very calm a very calm demeanor as well as very calm body language, and he didn't act out what happened to him. He just he spoke about what happened to him, as well as going into depth at the scene of the crime, what had happened. So it was very easy for the audience to not get overwhelmed by his story, even though it was pretty graphic and very traumatizing for him. He was able to not let his trauma get the better of him in explaining what occurred to him. Moving on to the investigators, specifically around the death of Paul Stein in Presidio Heights in San Francisco on October 11th, 1969. He was a cab driver and was murdered in his cab. And when some witnesses called 911, the operator got the fact that the suspect who had done it was an African American man, about 5'10". And when the police officers got onto the scene, the children that were in the area reported a 5'10" tall white man. And this allowed for the police to start looking for the right person. But before they had the right information, there were a couple officers who passed a man meeting the description of the killer, although they didn't know it. So as time went on, the Zodiac Killer wrote letters into different news outlets, as well as his infamous transcribes of his pictograms, that only a few of them, I think there's 4, only 2 of them have been ever solved. He admitted in one of the letters that a police officer had seen him and drove past him and asked if he had seen anything suspicious, which he got away with his crime. For this crime specifically, because there was no victim that survived it, there were very little information about what the crime actually looked like or how it happened or anything like that. But it focuses on the investigators. And the investigators of this crime have many different opinions on what actually happened, and only some of them reported certain things at the scene of the crime or the day of the crime, and some of them said things later, which makes it very difficult when watching this documentary to understand what's truthful and what is not, because of the fact that there's multiple different stories that contradict each other. The language use in this part was very easy to understand and was not overwhelming to the audience, but the content of what was being said was confusing. Their tone was appropriate for the situation, and they were not overly excited or, monotone. They had a flow that was smooth and easy to compute what they were trying to say, even though the information was contradictory. The body language that the investigators, specifically 2 investigators, were presenting with were calm and not super distracting. They weren't using their hands to communicate. They were just sitting, having a conversation with the camera, and having specific questions asked by the crew. Overall, looking at this entire documentary, the information that was provided was easy to understand, although at times confusing and contradictory to itself, because of different investigators, victims, and stories having different facts and information by different people that had their own opinions on what had happened. But the tone throughout was relatively calm, cool, collected, easy to understand. The words that was being used were not super difficult, and the victims themselves were very calm. At least Brian was, and for Mike, he was a little excited at times, and he was a little bit more all over the place. And he was the only one in the entire documentary that had a different tone, different word choice, was struggling to be able to collect his thoughts in a organized manner. Although he was still able to describe what had happened to him, but they used more of the investigator's story than Mike's story of what had happened. So thanks for watching my video. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!